This panel is stacked with talent, so I want to say hello to, of course, Lieutenant Governor Sabina Matos. You already know Mike Lydon, Weaynonnoh Nelson-Davies from the Economic Progress Institute. She's the executive director, so good to see you. You're also a City Year alum, as am I.
Oh,
so.
okay.
And Scott, of course, has already talked to us, and he's fantastic. Given that we have a little bit of time issues, I want to very quickly, I have two questions each for you, so I'm going to actually just ask them sort of in order to each of you. Mike, I want to start with you. You gave us a few examples of communities that are doing, doing transit and housing particularly well. I'm curious what you see as trends in those communities. What makes it possible to do this work? And then if you can give us a couple examples of places that are doing good work on these issues.
I think it's like anything, it's political leadership. Having a vision and sticking to it and staying true to the value, believing the value that will deliver in the mid to long term, which we've all recognized politically is very difficult in the short term. I'll give an example right now in Jersey City. So another mid-sized city, a little bit bigger than Providence, but kind of a similar in composition to a degree. It's kind of the, adjacent to Boston, Providence, and then Jersey City, adjacent to New York. They've invested so heavily in not just housing, where they've actually seen the average housing unit price come down over the last several years. So they're saying yes to housing, not no. But coupling that with large-scale transportation investments in key corridors, doing road diets. They, of course, have good existing transit service, both light rail and subway system, but realizing there's big corners of the city that aren't connected to that network, and developing public-private partnerships with an organization like VIA, which can reach quickly and take 10 people at a time to transit hubs, to places of economic opportunity in the sort of further flung neighborhoods. So bringing those, the densification of housing, the transportation piece, and then really focusing on the quality of life through public space is a really interesting, I think, example for other communities to look at sort of holistically. Right now the city has a campaign called the Year of Open Space, where the mayor every year focuses on a new issue, and it's open space this year. And I think it's very timely seeing the impact of the pandemic and how we all craved and needed access to parks, playgrounds, bike trails, et cetera, and they're building that in spades in Jersey City.
Yeah, there's been this move, of course, during the pandemic to move to remote working and things like that. And what opportunities do you see actually from the pandemic coming out of it that that really can kind of again sort of promote the kind of work that we'd like to see here in Providence, but all across the state?
So can you repeat the first part? You've seen people moving to?
Yeah, so just when you think about that, yeah.
Well, I think that's Rhode Island's competitive advantage, is that you do have a very high quality of life here. And so don't forget that. You have wonderful towns and villages. You have a great city in Providence. It is a small state. You can get to know people quickly. And it's harder to do in a much larger sort of geography. So people seeing that value, they've moved here for that value. And I think what's important is to think about the impact that can have, both good and bad, and being able to address the pressure on housing, for example, which was there before the pandemic, right? But now has been exacerbated further. So just think about how you can not only leverage this new investment or the people who've moved here, but keep them here and create other opportunities for other people who already live here, and again, in your town centers, village centers, and cities. So I think that's really the key opportunity, and just to compete on quality of life.
That's fantastic. Lieutenant Governor Matos, you're the person we get to grill about the politics. You've been the city council president in Providence, where we talked about a little bit about sort of resistance, but generally speaking, I think as Mike said, Providence has really embraced transportation and is really trying to do more on affordable housing. As you're kind of charged with housing as your issue as lieutenant governor. And I'm curious, what's the number one kind of barrier that you see as you talk to different governments around the state to advancing kind of this progress?
Thank you so much. So what I have found is that what is the perception of when we talk about affordable housing. Everyone has this negative connotation of what affordable housing is or what affordable housing looks like. And there is a lack of understanding about who the housing is going to be for. There is also a perception that when you talk about building new housing necessarily means that you're going to have this influx of people coming from outside your community to take over, right? And that is not the case. So a lot of what I've been doing is speaking to different communities about, would you like to have teachers living in your communities? The answer is yes. Would you like to have firefighters living in your community? Yes. Would you like to have police officers living in your communities? Yes. But right now, these are individuals that are not able to afford living in most of our communities in the state of Rhode Island. And another thing that I've been doing a lot is just touching on the pandemic, is reminding people that in the last 2 years, we have been clapping and praising the heroes that were working during the pandemic while all of us were stuck at home. And let me tell you, that includes the grocery workers, the people that were working at the supermarket, and those individuals are not able to find a place to live because they can't afford it right now.
You know, one thing that is kind of concerning to me is we're seeing this kind of migration of affluent folks from Boston or from New York coming in, and there's a lot of energy that comes in, and people love to live in the city. We love that part of it. But I do wonder, for the average Rhode Islander, how do we make sure that the additional people coming in are actually kind of a value add as opposed to just a housing cost add?
I think actually, and it's so great because Grossmark did a study about the impact that it would have in the economy of the state of Rhode Island if we would grow the population. And we were looking at what if we can get the city of Providence to be 250,000 people like it was before.
Yeah.
And I was talking to Dave Colwitt about this, and when he told me that we used to have 250 people, like, where were they living at that time? But it's going to have such a tremendous impact if we can get to that point. But we have to be very intentional about how we do it. I think of some of the things that I experienced in the city council at the local level, and now I'm experiencing also at the statewide, is this resistance to be more creative about the type of housing that we build. But at the same time, I'm very encouraged. Like, if you see the plan that Warren is doing, it's really innovative, and if you have not seen it, you should take a look at it. It's making sure that we have a zoning that is place-based, that is encouraging the constructions of more housing units on top of, just as we saw, on top of the commercial corridor. And Warren is doing an amazing work. So we need to do that to make sure that the zonings that we have in place, the development of housing that we have in place is inclusive. So someone that comes to move to the state of Rhode Island become part of the community and is engaged in what's happening here. One thing that I would like to also highlight, and I have to give a shout out to the planning department of the city of Providence, Bonnie Nickers and Martina Haggerty, because we did so much work together, right? And in most of the time we were on the same page, sometimes we were not, but that is okay. And that is what it's going to take in order for us to build the communities that are welcoming of new individuals, but also that embrace and engage the resident that has been here all along. We need to have real, honest conversations, and we have to do something that is very difficult for us to do in politics or in leadership, and is to understand when maybe I didn't get it right this time, maybe I needed more input, and being able to go back at the table and start over and listening to every voice.
Yeah, it's almost like you got to be nimble, but you also have to be decisive.
Yes, and but this is something that we always say we want inclusive leadership, but when we have inclusive leadership, we rush to label the individuals as undecisive. But inclusive leadership takes time, and it takes, and it's a little bit messy, yeah. Right? But that's the way how we can make sure that every voice is at the table and is represented. And we have to be willing to have a little bit more patience and not to rush to label leaders or decision makers one way or the other, because that's what caused that many leaders, many politicians just are making decisions based on the headline and not on what is most important for the community.
Sorry again. Weaynonnoh, I'd like to make you the kind of czar for federal spending in this state right now. Let's pretend we hand you the keys, or the purse strings, I suppose. How would you spend all this federal money that's coming in? Not so much, you could use the ARPA money, but certainly the federal transportation money that we're going to see. I'm curious how you would spend it to kind of build a more equitable Rhode Island.
That's a dangerous question to ask me. Because the Economic Progress Institute, one of the things we've been doing is telling our leaders how we want them to spend this money. And we do it through a racial and economic justice lens. And why is that important? I'm going to take us back 87 years ago during the New Deal. We spent between 1934 and 1965 $120 billion worth of money in subsidized housing by the government. Less than 2% went to Black and brown communities. And so I am very nervous about this great opportunity we have and who's going to be missing from it if we're not careful. So housing, definitely, we're happy that the state of Rhode Island have decided to spend about $250 million on housing. But I want us to also, as we're implementing that, to think again about which communities are going to be missing and included. And so when we're spending that money, I want to make sure we think about those communities. Neighborhood trusts, we had pushed to invest more in community-based organizations who are the ones in the communities, serving the people in the communities. I would want us to spend more money on those community leaders and members who are saying this is what our community needs to go back to people power, to go back to saying we value what you have to say because you're dealing with the problems and you have the solution. So I want to spend more money on that. Behavioral health is a big issue. We're coming out of a pandemic. So sort of thinking about how do we really invest into making sure our communities feel safe emotionally, mentally, as well as physically. Small businesses, I would have loved for us to invest more in our small businesses, because when we think about those communities who have been missing from the table, most of our small businesses owners in the state of Rhode Island are Black and brown owners. And so how do we invest in those communities so they feel that they are a part of the community? And I have many more other ways we can spend this money.
So pull Weaynonnoh aside, and she'll talk your ear off for a while. One more question, Weaynonnoh, I was asking Mike a little bit about, this kind of the move to remote working and kind of what it means for our downtowns in particular. And it dawns on me that unfortunately, the folks who have the luxury of working remotely tend to be more affluent, tend to be, higher educated, things like that. Do you see the move to remote working as something that can be, a positive trend for the broader and bigger picture here, or do you think it's actually going to kind of sort of extend the divide that we see between kind of the wealthy and the lower middle class, I suppose?
Right. I think it's not an either or, in my opinion. I think, again, we cannot forget about communities who will not be able to work remotely. Right. Our caregivers, those essential workers who took care of us while we had the privilege of working from home. So I do think we have to pay attention to those communities, make sure they are being paid their worth and value. So I think we need to invest in that. We need to invest in training and education so they can have upward mobility like the rest of us have, right? So they can move into positions and have options of where they want to work. I think flexibility within how our work structure is also important, because it allows us to spend more time with our family, and it allows us to understand that workers are able to do work we trust them to do their work from where they are. So I think there's a balance in creating flexibility and sort of being creative in how we think about how that flexibility works, and then also considering communities who will never have that option of flexibility because they're required to show up to take care of the rest of us, and we need to make sure we're invested in them as well.
That's fantastic. Scott, I loved the way you broke down the 4 C's before when you're in your opening speech: cash, capacity, creativity, and coordination. For the first time in a really long time, I think we got the cash covered.
We do.
What's the next most important thing of the 4 C's, and how do we get there?
I think probably capacity, because we need to have capacity to implement projects and new investment streams. And I'm very concerned that at the municipal level, with the exception of the Providences and the Cranstons and the Warwicks and the bigger communities, you've got a lot of small communities in Rhode Island that maybe have 1 full-time planner, no economic development director, no real housing specialist, and they need help in order to implement some of these projects, even if they're not massive projects, even smaller projects. So I really think the state has to step up with some of its resources and provide more technical assistance, and maybe even subsidize some of these communities to hire 1 additional planning staffer. That kind of thing, I think, has to happen, because otherwise we will have all this money and we won't get the bang for the buck we should be getting for it. And we need more capacity in some parts of state government too. And I think when it comes to housing, there's a move underfoot by Lieutenant Governor Matos and her boss to increase the number of FTEs for the housing function in Rhode Island. So.
Yeah, you know, it dawns on me that I wrote a couple weeks ago about the Partnership for Rhode Island is going to pay for a little bit of, I think, like federal grant assistance, but particularly for, you know, smaller kind of places that might not have a full-time grant writer, you know, in a small community. But I think you're right; it extends further than that. You know, you need additional staffing,
especially if we want sustainable, equitable, efficient development that doesn't tear up our farmland and our forest land. Because the path of least resistance, the easiest kind of development is to tear up the farmland and the forest land. That doesn't require as much sophistication, as much technical assistance as doing infill, as having village zoning. And so if the smart growth agenda is to thrive, we definitely need more capacity. If the state's going to thrive, we need more capacity.
I'll leave you with the last answer, and I want to come back to where I started. We're in an election year. You could have lots of changes come January 2023. Sabina says that she doesn't think that'll happen, but who knows?
She can't think that's going to happen.
That's right. I'm curious from all of your years of experience, you've dealt with various governors and various administrations all across the state. I mean, what do you see as both the number one kind of, I guess, what makes you very optimistic about the next, the next 10 years, let's say, and then what's the big red flag when we do see change in government?
So in terms of the change in governor, or just
Change
regardless of who the governor is?
I should say in government, period, because let's pretend that Sabina and Governor McKee potentially get reelected, but certainly you'll have a new mayor in Providence, for example.
Sure. Well, I think one of the things that always concerns me, and I think my colleagues in the Smart Growth Movement, is having leaders who are willing to look beyond the next election cycle. And that's not easy to do. And I ran for office. I was a political consultant. I think I understand some of the short-term pressures that elected officials and aspirants to elective office have. But and we've got to kind of provide, as voters, we've got to provide some reward for people who look long-term. And clearly, you have to have, as Mike was saying, you have to have some short-term action to have long-term change. And so we need to be helping our leaders to figure that out and to execute that. I think one of the big concerns I have for the state, and it's only tangentially a smart growth issue, is the state of urban education. And we cannot have a thriving state, or at least not thrive at our potential, if we're going to leave so many of our black and brown kids behind. And we've got to be innovative. I think we have to allow more competition, more charter schools, but we also have to make sure that our core public school system is stronger and that our elites are more involved in it. I mean, we've got a situation in Rhode Island where most of our elites, at least in some communities, they don't have a stake in the public school system because they don't send their kids to it.
Yeah.
And that's a long-term festering problem.
We should have another conference on the future of urban education in Rhode Island, I think. Folks, I believe we have a little bit of a break, but I want to say thank you to Scott, Weaynonnoh, Mike, of course, Lieutenant Governor Matos. Big round of applause for them. And thank you so much for having me here once again. If you don't subscribe to Roadmap, it's a free daily newsletter. You should do it. And enjoy the break and enjoy the rest of the day. It's going to be great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you.